Full disclosure, I am not a speech pathologist. I am also not a translator. I am someone who has worked with both of these professions in an attempt to make easy read materials accessible to culturally diverse people with disabilities. It has been no small feat. In the field of speech pathology, a field defined by the processes of communication, the expression lost in translation wields a particular weight. Speech pathologists and allied health professionals who work with culturally and linguistically diverse CALD clients often engage interpreters or translators to reach beyond the cultural borders of our multicultural communities. However, Australia does not have a consistent multilingual glossary of disability terminology, meaning that translated speech pathology resources lack consistency and cultural sensitivity. Put simply, cross-cultural adaptation can undermine the very purpose of speech pathology resources that you are producing. This presentation identifies and explores the challenges of translating speech pathology resources, including words and images, into languages other than English through a case study focusing on easy English materials developed for the National Speak My Language Disability Program. Speak My Language is a national initiative led by the Ethnic Communities Council of New South Wales, or ECC New South Wales, aiming to share lived experience and resources about disability through a multilingual format. We set about creating easy English materials with the assistance of a speech pathologist, Access Easy English, that could be translated into 25 languages other than English. Translating our information sheet with consistency and cultural sensitivity was easier said than done. We were not alone in this problem. Wherever the disability and CALD spaces intersect, the challenge of translation presents itself. We went looking for a standardized, evidence-based approach to translating easy English resources into languages other than English. Our literature review found that practically none exists. Newman highlights that the often ad hoc development of easy English materials diminishes their effectiveness, as the end user is not always considered or consulted during the material's creation. Collaborating with people who have intellectual disabilities when developing easy English materials is the preferred practice, but does not always take place. This lack of consistency in the development of easy English materials is magnified when translation comes into play. So ECC New South Wales set about establishing a best practice framework guided by our speech pathology consultant. We commissioned speech pathologist Papastavros, owner of Access Easy English, to create easy English information sheets for the Speak My Language program. ECC New South Wales worked in collaboration with key stakeholders and then validated the translated easy English resources via test readers representative of the program's target end users. During the planning stage, we held workshops with the Speak My Language advisory and reference groups consisting of multicultural community leaders and individuals with disabilities from CALD backgrounds. These groups worked with Kathy Basterfield to provide cultural perspectives on the language and choices of images for the Easy English information sheets. The information sheets were then designed by Access Easy English and translated by an accredited NAATI translating service into 25 languages. ECC New South Wales recruited people with disabilities from CALD backgrounds with low or very low literacy in their first language to act as test readers. The test readers assessed the easy read information sheets and were interviewed to record their feedback about their effectiveness. The translated materials were then reviewed by a second round of community readers with high literacy levels in their first language to identify the cultural connotations of the word disability and related terminology. I will now go on to outline the challenges and successes of this model and the strategies that can be replicated in the future. Our case study confirmed that it is not possible to simply translate an easy English resource into languages other than English and expect it to be effective. We anticipated the complexities that would arise due to translation, both from the literature available and our practical experience in the CALD sector. According to Hall et al., the cross-cultural adaptation of speech pathology resources does not require word-for-word translation, but rather a world-for-world translation in which the cultural context is applied with local knowledge and sensitivity of the CALD community. Borman and Lau concur, acknowledging that globally, the challenge remains to develop culturally valid, contextually relevant, and reliable speech-language pathology resources that will meet the needs of the unique populations they serve. We knew from the outset that a word-for-word translation would be essential. The issue we encountered was an inconsistency and lack of cultural sensitivity around the translated terminology referring to disability, accessibility, diversity, and inclusion. Direct translations often ignored cultural taboos and stigmas associated with these words, images, and concepts that we were addressing. According to Sutherland and Isherwood, these complexities are part and parcel of translating knowledge into a comprehensive, easy English format, where the end user, because they are CALD, requires a second translation of the materials into a language other than English. This process of knowledge translation becomes even more difficult. Even with our early consultation co-design workshops, our 2 rounds of test readers presented a nuanced set of challenges to be resolved. Firstly, feedback throughout the co-design process proved that the use of images in easy read materials is contentious. The translated Easy English resources contained simple, illustrated images like the ones on the screen. We were unable to reach a consensus on how to represent disability and diversity through these images. For instance, the concept of cultural diversity was difficult to represent in visual aids. One advisory group participant argued that skin tone was the most obvious indicator of cultural diversity. Another participant disagreed, arguing that traditional dress was a stronger symbol of cultural identity. Each participant held a different view, reflecting their individual subjectivity as well as the nuanced subjectivity of the cultural community they represented. It was not possible to find a universal visual aid that clearly denoted cultural diversity. Similarly, images chosen to represent the concept of inclusion proved to be problematic. The images selected show people with and without disabilities together, coded to appear from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds through skin tones and clothing. Participants highlighted that the image that we originally chose was difficult to interpret because it contained too much color and detail between the foreground and the background, and only those with physical disabilities were represented. Ultimately, the divergent feedback regarding the use of images in the resources affirms the findings of Sutherland and Isherwood, who argue that visual aids may obscure the meaning of the text because they require subjective symbolic processing. In this instance, the highly subjective nature of processing made it difficult to find images universally representative of cultural diversity or disability, as both diversity and disability are by their very nature unique and varied lived experiences. The issue here is, of course, layered. Firstly, a person, their unique cultural background may influence the way they interpret an image. And secondly, if that person has an intellectual disability, this will further influence their ability to interpret the image. We found that images often obscured meaning rather than aided it, something that is reflected in current academic debate around the efficacy of visual aids in easy English materials. The best practice would be to tailor the images in each translated Easy English information sheet to reflect the specific CALD community it had been designed for, rather than representing cultural diversity as a universal experience. However, this would have incurred additional time and costs, as the images would vary across each translated version of the original document. As this was not a viable option for our program, we limited the use of images to those that were easiest to interpret and relied on the text to explain concepts such as inclusion and diversity. This takes us to our second point, the text. Even in an easy English format, the translation of words and concepts such as inclusion, accessibility, and disability proved to be challenging. After the Easy English information sheet had been translated by a certified NAATI translating service, the materials underwent 2 rounds of community testing. These 2 rounds of testing by community readers with a with and without disabilities found that the translations were word to word and not world to world interpretations of the original Easy English document. Lay's research focusing on interpreter-mediated experiences of the NDIS has highlighted the inconsistencies across translated glossaries and materials that are not culturally sensitive or accessible. Translated NDIS resources such as brochures or flyers do not address cultural taboos or beliefs, making the information inaccessible despite its translation. It was left to bilingual interpreters to create the conditions for cross-cultural adaptation, as the resources alone were not enough. And significantly, Lay's research, which was only conducted in 2021, notes that this is not unique to the NDIS and is prevalent across Australia's public service resources. In the absence of a consistent glossary of translated disability terminology, we relied on the input of our co-design participants. This is why we propose a client or person-centered approach should always be applied in the development of resources for CALD people with disabilities, assuring that the translated materials are not simply translated word to word, but also are culturally adapted to convey messages in a culturally appropriate way. In our experience, some accredited translators used offensive or outdated terms to describe disabilities in our translated Easy English information sheets. For other languages, the translators were unable to express words easily, such as inclusion, as this term did not exist within their community's cultural context. The evidence suggests that our experience is not an anecdotal outlier, and this occurs wherever translations are required. I will provide an example to illustrate the issue. Our Mandarin test reader noted that the translated documents use the term "canfai." This term is now considered outdated and offensive within Chinese communities because it associates disability with being useless or impaired. Our test reader explained that the preferred term now is "cansang," which emphasizes the dignity of the person with a disability. Cansang means to be impaired and disabled by barriers, aligning with the social model of disability. We chose to follow our community tester's advice and replace the original word used for disability with the new term, cansang. Without our test reader's input, there would have been no way for us to know an accredited translating service had used an offensive and outdated term. This is why co-design is essential when translating Easy English resources in a culturally sensitive way. It is not enough to rely on a certified translating service to provide a word-for-word translation. And likewise, speech pathologists should not rely on translators to interpret concepts that may be loaded with sensitivities and taboos that create additional barriers with clients. You may be thinking that a robust and expensive co-design process is not worth the simple, easy read information sheet it produced. However, for us, this experience was deeply rewarding and affirming of the work the Ethnic Communities Council of New South Wales is currently undertaking. The recommendations of our test readers showed an evolution in terminology that is evidence of changing attitudes within our culturally diverse communities. Ensuring that CALD people with disabilities are involved in the co-design of speech pathology resources is currently the only way to ensure the effectiveness of the materials. Lay concludes her research of the NDIS with a significant recommendation that I would like to echo here. Firstly, she notes that Australia does not currently have a database that offers a glossary of consistent and culturally sensitive disability terminology in languages other than English. As a result, the onus is placed on interpreters and translators to manage translation inconsistencies and mediate their own process of cross-cultural adaptation when interpreting disability terminology, leaving room for miscommunication, offense, and translation error. Lay references international organizations such as the United Nations and the European Union, who employ terminologists to develop databases that collect, review, harmonize, and maintain disability terminology data across multilingual settings. This ensures consistency and cultural sensitivity when translating disability terminology, while also mapping terms that become socially outdated in other languages. Other multicultural countries have developed their own multilingual database of disability terminology. For instance, the Government of Canada's Translation Bureau has developed an accessibility glossary with English and French equivalents to 342 concepts. Likewise, in New Zealand, not-for-profit organisation Te Pau launched a Maori language glossary for use in mental health and disability sectors. The initiative created 200 new Maori words designed to elevate and empower people with various conditions. Should Australia develop a similar terminological database for languages other than English, inconsistencies in translating disability-related materials would be greatly minimised. Moreover, the significant expense associated with our best practice approach would have been largely eliminated if a national database of disability terminology was created. This would assist bilingual healthcare workers, allied health professionals, disability and aged care workers, social workers, interpreters, and translators, as well as speech pathologists. It would take the onus off translators and community interpreters by guaranteeing consistency and dignity in the disability terminology being used. Until then, the only way speech pathologists can bridge the boundaries between disability and cultural diversity is to enable a person-centered practice that provides nuanced world-to-world translations.